Welcome back. Our first panel discussion is about how Haus der Kunst, the historical incriminated building, has been dealt with since the post-war period. Dealings that also reflect the complex process of coming to terms with ideology and power. Today's first panel will be moderated by Iris Lauterbach, who we welcome at Haus der Kunst. Iris Lauterbach is an art historian and a research fellow at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte here in Munich. She held a research grant from the Bibliotheca Hertziana in Rome and is co-founder of the International Network for Art History. In her publication, she has focused on the architecture of the Nazi period as well as the cultural politics of the post-war period. And her new project will be a book on the history of the Munich Central Art Collecting Point. Iris Lauterbach took also part in the realization of the database Giddy Research, the first high-performance platform for the exploration of the great German art exhibitions. Welcome again, Iris Lauterbach.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. So, good morning, everybody. I, first of all, would like to introduce shortly the four speakers of the podium, starting with Chris Dercon. The participants will speak and make their contributions in the order which you see here on the podium, so starting with Chris Dercon. I really don't have to introduce him, but as former director of Haus der Kunst, but it's a pleasure to do it. And Chris now, as you know, came to Munich from London, where since last year he is head of Tate Modern. He had been a director of several institutions before starting his work here in Munich in 2003. And while the director here at the Haus der Kunst, he presented a wide range of exhibitions which many of you will have seen, exhibitions with a very large interdisciplinary approach, a program including architecture, design, fashion, film, and photography. It's him, and that is why we're really looking forward to his contribution. It's him who started and introduced the opening of the institution's historical archive. And he also initiated the so-called critical reconstruction concerning the architecture and this building, the architecture of this building. Next speaker will be Monika Flacke. Monika Flacke is chief curator at the German Historical Museum in Berlin. She specialized in the field of illustrated history, museology, and generally speaking in the correlation of images and texts. She was, together with Haus der Kunst, a partner of Giddy Research. As you know, this platform for more than 12,000 images of the great German art exhibitions has been realized by my institution, the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte, together with these partners. And it can be consulted since since October, but since 3 days only in English. And so you are invited, also those who are not fluent in German, to consult this platform when you are online, because I'm sorry, it has not been possible, as I was told, to install an access in the exhibition upstairs. So Monika Flacke collaborated with us in providing the images and data for Giddy Research, and she is an expert in Nazi image policies and the construction of history and memory in times of political crisis. Christian Philipp Müller is a very important figure on this podium too, because it's him who has been invited to design the exhibition upstairs. He's an artist and active as rector of the Kunsthochschule Kassel, working between Kassel and Berlin. He has worked at the Skulpturprojekte Münster, and he has participated in numerous major exhibitions such as the Venice Biennale, the Documenta, Manifesta, and he has also been invited this year to participate the Documenta. He has had many solo exhibitions, and the Kunstmuseum Basel presented a retrospective of his work in 2007. Mark Wigley, last but not least, is an architect and an architectural critic, and as well as theorist. He's Dean of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and has before also taught at Princeton University. His research and publications deal with a wide range of topics concerning architecture and the deconstruction of architecture, such as the architecture of deconstruction, Derrida's Haunt, or Constance' New Babylon, the hyper-architecture of desire. He was guest curator at several museums, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal. So, welcome to this podium, and let's start with Chris Dercon with your talk.
Thank you, Iris. Can we have the first slide? Okay, there we go. This is an image which I found yesterday on the mobile phone of one of the people who were working in the Golden Bar. And my question is this now an example of critical reconstruction? Is this an example of preservation? Or is this a major accident on the road? I would call it a major accident on the road of the Haus der Kunst, because what happened a couple of months ago, it was decided by the administration of buildings, the Bauadministration here in Beieren, that the balustrade of the terrace, and you have to go and see it, on the north side was unsafe. It was 14 centimeters too low, and it was way too close to going down. So what the bar people did, because they didn't want to put off their clients, they wanted to install camouflage nets, because they thought they were going to maybe make a work of art, they were going to illustrate the history. Nobody really knew where it came from, but it happened, but it was decided by the directors of the Haus der Kunst and the curators to take it down. So my question is, what is this? By the way, critical reconstruction was not invented by me. It was brought to us, it was imported from Berlin by our curator, Leon Krempel, who is very much aware and was aware very much about the process of reconstruction at the Museum Insel. And it was actually a term claimed by the curators working on the Museum Insel together with David Chipperfield. So critical reconstruction comes aus Berlin. And I asked last week of David Chipperfield, David, do you know where the term comes from? And he said it was invented by the marketing people who wanted to explain what was going on at the Museum Insel. That said, this image bank, which I created to open this panel discussion, it has about 90 images. I have 12 minutes, so 8 seconds an image. Then Graham thinks that's enough to understand the images. We can always come back to the images. This said, this image bank was created thanks to the invaluable help of Mathieu Wellner and Iris Ludwig, and thanks to the help, of course, of all these researchers who have been working on the house and its history all these years when I was director, to start with Leon Krempel, Jochen Meister, after Sabine Brandl, and then Mathieu Wellner, and now Christian Philipp Müller. One of the images which, of course, springs to mind is this image of the opening of the building where Hitler was giving a speech which nobody could understand because he was shouting too loud, or was the acoustics of the Ehrenhalle bad. In any case, what was interesting, you see above Hitler, you see the radio operators, because his opening speech was broadcasted nationwide. I'm showing this because these images we presented to the collector Aidessa Hendeles when she got to curate her first exhibition, Partners, which was the opening exhibition of the new team of the Haus der Kunst in 2003. I chose this image also to point to you the beautiful, and Mark can maybe comment on that later. You see the white dresses of these two visitors of the Haus der Kunst, and you see also the use of textile. It's very interesting that the use of textile has been a continuation in the Haus der Kunst, which I will point out to. But we always look at the beginning of the Haus der Kunst. What we do forget, and Benjamin Buchloh and Sabine Brandl pointed it out already directly and indirectly, which is the history of exhibitions. When we decided to show photography, when we decided to show fashion, when we decided to show in design, industrial design, architecture, this was not an invention of us. It was part of the history of the Haus der Kunst, because in 1958 there was a fantastic exhibition, a film exhibition of Henri Langlois. There was a very early exhibition of Frank Lloyd Wright. There was a very, very important exhibition of Le Corbusier. So the Haus der Kunst has a history in terms of its international connections, also with other practices, not just the practice of visual arts. Another practice, of course, are the so-called Faschingsfeste. And I want to point this decoration, or this mural, which is interesting because it refers to what? It refers to Beckmann, yes, but it also refers to Cobra, and it was organized, it was created by local Künstlers, local artists who were part of the Große Kunstausstellung, who were responsible for decorating these incredible Faschingsfests. I'm showing this because this was the source of inspiration, this history, for the first exhibition we initiated, which was like a manifesta, partners by Idessa Hendles. And we showed of the collection of Idessa Hendles, who comes and is a Jewish family. She commissioned Catalan to create the work Hymn 2001 by Hitler. And this was the very first exhibition. We created the new team at the Haus der Kunst, and it began like some sort of manifesta. It created also a lot of confusion, because when we invited artists, these artists always came back to this exhibition, and this reminds me of a very important discussion which we had on November 9, 2007, which was moderated by Mark Wigley, whereby Mark Wigley said the following. He said, preservation being the contingency of the founding of the Haus der Kunst, preservation, the conservation of ancient culture, German culture, preservation is an impossible thing to do, because preservation literally means to let die or to kill off. In any case, whatever you do, you always commit a crime. And then he asked the question to Jacques Herzog and Rem Koolhaas, what kind of criminal do you want Chris Dercon to be? Well, I definitely was one criminal, because I was guilty of stressing, because of the exhibition partners, the so-called aura-making machine of the Haus der Kunst, the aura-making machine of the Haus der Kunst, which led to many, I admit, many catastrophic installations, catastrophic as an illustration of a catastrophe, and to installations which got bigger and bigger over time, which then concluded Rem Koolhaas and Jacques Herzog. Then the modernism, the so-called modernism of the Haus der Kunst, is a perfect example fit for the catastrophic theatrical expressions of contemporary art. And I don't know if that was good or bad. In any case, it is a kind of crime, isn't it? But we also did other things. One of our major inspirers was Alexander Kluge, and Alexander Kluge designed this poster for the Haus der Kunst. Utopia gets always better when you wait for it. I would say the critical reconstruction of the Haus der Kunst, the renovation, gets always better as long as we wait for it, because it's still not there. We also organized other things. We occupied the ehemalige Erehalle with many, many different events. This is an event, Utopia Station, where Tony Negri spoke. And it was funny that Tony Negri the evening before spoke for an audience of 1,700 people in the Volksbühne, but immerhin we had 37 the next evening. This is interesting because when Benjamin Buchloh came back for the first time to give a lecture in Munich, I hope Benjamin remembers that, then he said, I was never invited in Munich, but immerhin we had 57 audience members for Buchloh, so not too bad for Munich after Tony Negri. We also asked other artists to intervene and to work with the Haus der Kunst. This is the West African artist Mesha Kaba, who created the hairdress in the model of the Haus der Kunst, and he decided to put next to the hairdress the work of Marcel Broodhaars, Le Musée d'Art Moderne fermé à clause de faillite. One of the most beautiful works, Benjamin pointed it out already, I think, is the work of Lawrence Wiener. Now what's interesting is that the original conception of Lawrence Wiener not only had a text, he also wanted to wire up the trees. These trees, of course, they camouflage is always coming back, they camouflaged the view of the Haus der Kunst, which led Jacques Herzog to say that the trees which were planted in the 60s were a kind of pubic hair, schaamhaar. And Lawrence understood that, and he started to wrap up the pubic hair created in the 60s, by the way, by the same architects who worked in the 50s on the Haus der Kunst, on the Reconstruction. And this was never executed. This was the result. The pubic hair was not fully blossoming yet. And this is another intervention by the architects of the stadium, Allianz Arena, when the IFA, the International Football Bond, decided that it was not allowed anymore to have the sign of Allianz Arena on the stadium. We decided to transplant it to the Haus der Kunst, which of course was an interesting comment on Allianz and its many alliances during the Second World War. This is another intervention by Lawrence Wiener on the bookshop by Konstantin Gircic. Konstantin Gircic, who is another designer, artist, architect who we worked with. And one of the first things we did was restoring the Golden Bar. These images were created not by Dallmayr in 37, but by Dallinger in 37. And we found these images back behind orange wood, painted plywood, and we decided to restore them. There was not much to do because it was full of nicotine, and so it was very easy to preserve them. But it was the first time the original green and the original murals came back, and Konstantin Gircic decided to create an interior. A very important exhibition after Idessa Händler's, also Manifesto, was the exhibition of the Bechers. The Bechers, I remind you, never had really a big exhibition in Munich except at the Neue Sammlung in the Industrial Design Museum, and it was the first time they came back. And I would say that the combination of partners and the Bechers was the kind of blueprint we used to set off a series of exhibitions which dealt directly and indirectly with the history of the house. And I would say that this is much more part of a critical reconstruction than the actual additions we decided to do in the house or the actual cleaning of the house, because the first phase of the so-called critical reconstruction was cleansing the house from 2003 to 2007. This is an intervention by Paul McCarthy. We always look at the pirate ship, but I think this intervention, his fortress, was much more important because he played off to the Umgang, to this Rundgang of the festliche Rundgang of the opening of the Haus der Kunst in 1937, where Paul recreated this procession in Munich. And these images we never really see when we try to tell the history of the house, but I think this is a much more important image than the image of the pirate ship. Paul was very, very uncomfortable with the house, and he got really inspired by the exhibitions. This is a very good example of his work, and this is another example of his work. The Haus der Kunst is embedded in a greater constellation, and we found out that the house got isolated over time. Not only you see the pubic hair in front of the house, but also pubic hair in the back of the house. And we decided that it was time to reconnect the Haus der Kunst with the rest of the city. I will show you what we did. This is then the discussion with Mark Wigley and Rem Koolhaas and Jacques Herzog. We decided it was very important to ask two architects who came off very well in Munich because of the propaganda effect, and people took us seriously, and we asked them to help us to pose a series of questions we should ask ourselves before starting the renovation process. And the renovation process, of course, is necessary. It's not raining inside anymore, but now we have these new fences on the North Terrace. So whatever you do, you have to make a decision. You have to reconstruct, critically reconstruct, renovate, but whatever you do, it's always wrong. Estos muros son culpables, which was a piece which was written in La Vanguardia. And it's interesting that Rem Koolhaas and Jacques Herzog are sitting within their middle, the general urbanist of North Korea, who was very interested to come to the Haus der Kunst because he wanted to study, he said, the critical reconstruction, the renovation of the house, because apparently in Pyongyang there is a lot of reconstruction to do as well. And it was also a time when Jacques and Rem were very much involved themselves in these kind of architectures. I don't have to point out to you CCTV, and I don't have to point out to you, I think, another kind of Haus der Kunst in the meanwhile, which is the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg. which is of course a monument of the contemporary democratic, right-wing democratic constellation in Germany. These are our discussions. You see Sabine Brandl and Mathieu Wellner. I just want to point this out to you, that the discussions with Herzog and Kekolas was not just a matter of propaganda, it was a very serious undertaking. Mathieu Wellner and the offices in Rotterdam and Basel created this book, which is never published, but it's an interesting document. The strong questions we wanted to ask, the timeline of change, the timeline of exhibitions, and the critical moments and summary of change. I will show you some of them. The history, how can contemporary art be exhibited in such a building? How can the building be used in a modern way? And how can the anti-modern position be shown? Should it be shown? What should be done with historically contaminated buildings? These are the questions which we had besides technical problems. What are the situation? The situation was, of course, that the Haus der Kunst was surrounded, but at the same time completely isolated. And what kind of program we had to develop in this constellation of the Haus der Kunst. We decided to analyze the changes in the house, at the same time, not just talking about the architecture and the urbanism, but also to show what kind of exhibitions were shown. We will take back maybe these images when Mark is going to intervene. He can always call them up. Okay. This is critical moments and summary of change. This is Rem's remark about preservation. He says that the time in which we preserve becomes shorter and shorter. Now we, of course, have a kind of prospective time, because, you know, it's now the time to decide in Munich if we want to preserve the Pinakothek, the Moderne, or not, because you know that the Pinakothek, the Rotunda at least, is imploding, so we have to come up with the preservation of the Pinakothek at the same time as the preservation of the Haus der Kunst. And here are some of the notes we took in all these discussions. I just want to point out 1937 Hegel builds. I really don't know anymore what we meant by that. But what was very important was Kluge. Alexander Kluge was a major inspiration for all the work we did. And this is then the summary of change. Hitler in power, end of the world, military use, modern art, Wheeling, obstruction, obstruction, amputation, Wheeling, amputation, obstruction, Wheeling, transfusion, calls for unveiling, calls for opening. It's very interesting to see all these changes, and I think when you do talk about critical reconstruction, that you always refer to the changes which occurred after 1945, which are as essential as the changes which happened in the process between 1933 and 1945. These changes, which were put on a map by Herzog Demuro and by Mathieu Wellner, show very, very good and carefully that one of the major problems is what to do with that ehemalige Erehalle. The ehemalige Erehalle is constantly coming back in the discussions, not just in terms of the architectural reconstruction, but also in terms of the program and use. And it goes on and on, as you can see. Rem Koolhaas, who was talking about these big works getting bigger and bigger, not just because of the turbine hall in Tate Modern and Monumenta, but also a little bit because of the Haus der Kunst, he decided to show the history of the Haus der Kunst in an exhibition called Chronochaos in Venice. And he was addressing, of course, these catastrophic images which artists seemed to initiate all the time when they were commissioned or when they were asked to do an exhibition in the Haus der Kunst. This is the train, Swayamp, the animal which was created by Anish Kapoor, talking about catastrophic images with all these very unclear references to the history of the house. Here you see the original picture, and this is then how we found the house with pubic hair all over in 2003. We decided, by the way, to remove part of the plants growing up the wall, which looked, interestingly enough, like a kind of camouflage net structure. These are the trees in front of it, and this is what we then designed. We wanted to take the trees down again, which was refused by the same administration who is now talking about the height of the balustrade. Here we tried to make a compromise by putting one tree back. This is the situation surrounded by all these different museums, by the Prinzregenten-tunnel, and one of the most interesting situations was the building designed by SOM and then executed by Sepp Roof, which is the American consulate. The American consulate I was very interested in because they had also a balustrade, they had also a fencing, which is what we call the Washington visa regulation fences. And this is next to the Haus der Kunst op wall. this was the design by SOM and Sepp Roof as a response to the Haus der Kunst. And what we wanted very much was to think about this object and at the same time occupying the building of the American consulate of Sepp Roof, the building, using it for offices and other administration, even moving the archives to the building of Sepp Roof. It would have been such a great situation, such an amazing dialectical situation, and at the same time we could let die off the Haus der Kunst. This is another interesting moment of killing of the Haus der Kunst, because in '72 it was decided to create a tunnel. So what we proposed was to prolong the tunnel, that at least we could avoid this Autobahn effect, because you see that the Haus der Kunst is completely closed off the heart of Munich. This is very interesting, because in '72 it was decided to create a Japanese tea house in the back of the Haus der Kunst. So in a way, this is a very interesting tension, isn't it? At the South Terrace. And this says very much about the culture in Munich. It's called slowness. So we decided to renature the building, to open the building. This is an example of renaturing. It was also refused. It was refused, by the way, by people here in Munich, because parkings and dogs, not since the last Documenta, parking and dogs are holy in Munich as well. This is our discotheque, P1, which is not created by us. People think that. It was created in the 40s and the 50s, and Kokoschka had his first opening fest in P1. P1, Prinzregentenstraße #1, because the American soldiers who played basketball couldn't pronounce Prinzregentenstraße, so they said P1. This is another interesting aspect. This is the Eisbach, what to do with the Eisbach. And we decided to ask also artists to intervene. This is Alan Kaproff, a reconstruction in the front of the building, which was an echo of a fantastic intervention of Gustav Metzger in 1999, which was called Judenpech. And Gustav was asked again to work in the back an installation called Mirror Trees. This is the balustrade, which is now fenced off. It was already fenced off once in '72 when Paulo Nessler decided for the Olympics to build an extension on the north side of the Haus der Kunst. This is how the terraces were done at that moment. This is the exhibition of Rem, Chrono Chaos, in Venice, where he decided to to reinstall these pieces of furniture, which we still have. And what's interesting, when you talk about textiles, this is a situation in 1943, the whole Haus der Kunst. And again, very interesting that one section is completely tarnished, the other section not, by camouflage nets. The Haus der Kunst was packed in textiles, green and brown textiles, for over 2 years. This is a fantastic image, of course. It could be a contemporary art installation in Kassel, in the Auer Park right now. And this is how it looked in 43, 45. So until the liberation, 43, 45, and I just found out that the Lee Miller archives have pictures of the Haus der Kunst when it was opened up by the Americans. And it's interesting that the whole notion of textiles is coming back and coming back. And that led us to ask Petra Blijse, partner of OMA with Inside Outside, to design textiles for the ehemalige Erehalle, where our major inspirer, after Hegel built Alexander Kluge, where we asked Alexander Kluge to use it like a kind of new film studio projecting on the curtains. But Alexander was also absolutely seminal for undoing the wood structures, undoing the camouflage of the electricity installations in the Haus der Kunst. He admits, inspired by Harun Faruqi. So whenever you see electric installations uncovered by plexi, it's Alexander Kluge. What's interesting that the Waisenhof-Siedlungen in 1927, curated by Mies van der Rohe, at that time there were in the newspapers in Stuttgart these incredible cartoons and caricatures where you see people veiled, North African figures doing activities like market, selling carpets, having camels. And this was a critique then on the Waisenhof-Siedlung. And this is one of these figures which inspired the newspaper in Stuttgart. But we took that as an inspiration to continue to work with textiles. So instead of building hard walls, we decided to commission textile architects like Petra Blijse and the Egyptian architect Samir El-Kordi to make textile architecture in the Haus der Kunst. Wow. Voilà.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you to the one who invited me for this wonderful symposium. And, well, I'm happy to be here. And I'm talking about the history of the collection, which we have seen part of it in the exhibition upstairs. They are hosted in our house, and I'm responsible for this collection. Most of the more than 700 paintings and sculptures were bought by the Reichskanzler at the exhibition Haus of German Art between 1937 and 1944, and that have been stored in Munich main custom office since 1963. In 1949, the Haus of German Art collection was first taken over the Treuhandverwaltung für Kulturgut, Trust Administration for Cultural Assets, and later in 1963 by the Regional Tax Office of Munich. Some of you knew that there was in the Hauptzollamt. The Federal Republic of Germany is the owner of the art objects that once belonged to the former German Reich, following years of often intense public debates and disputes, like the reconstruction of, or the critical reconstruction of the Haus der Deutschen Kunst. In 1998, the Federal Ministry of Finance turned this collection over to the Federal Ministry of Interior. It was with the handover that they were transferred the same year to the German Historical Museum in Berlin. Thus, the decades-old question of what to do with this group of work was settled. Before this point, the management of the financial authorities had done nothing to make the works in this collection publicly known or exhibited, or the subject of research. In fact, until the mid of the 70s, Nazi art was not taken seriously by the public of art historians, and the federal government had not been turned such collections over to public museums. It was just hosted, as I said, in the Hauptzollamt, and no one really was interested in this collection until the 70s. When one looks at the more than 700 paintings and sculptures that survived in Munich's main custom office, one is baffled at the discrepancy between Hitler's totalitarian goals of art and the parent conventionally of the works, which primarily reflect 19th century artistic styles. The numerous depictions of landscapes and idyllic family scenes attest to a quality that would not result in the everlasting starry night of the eternal divinely inspired artist. Instead of finding honor and glory, nearly all of the dictator's favorite artists have long since been forgotten. Until now, those who were interested in Nazi art, either for art historical or other historical reasons, were unable to rely on reference works for information. Most of the biographies of these artists and sculptures are incomplete. You see it upstairs, there's Mr. Decker, who did the Amiens painting. You don't know when he died. Also are incomplete, and their careers often sank into oblivion after 1945. The records of the Federal Archive Document Center in Berlin help those seeking information on the period before 1945. The research results on the political and ideological entanglements of these artists are extremely revealing. Not all artists who exhibited their works on the Haus of German Art were members of the Nazi Party. Hence the gallery report, which claims that only Nazi Party members were allowed to submit works to the Great German Art Exhibition, must be refused. Additionally, not every artist was a minion of the state, belonged to the elite group of Nazi artists, who would have enjoyed social recognition and financial security. Some painters suffered great hardship. The Document Center contains a number of artist requests for financial assistance submitted to the Artist Aid Association Künstlerdank. The anti-modernism sentiment, which is evident in both the idyllic and center's files, had less to do with the painters' ages than with the fact that a large portion of trained artists flat out rejected the break the avant-garde made with academic art at the turn of the century. Thus, the painting style that dominated the work in the Haus of German Art cannot categorically be described as committed to National Socialism, but rather explained as a fundamental refusal to reveal the fictional quality of the representation visible to the public. In fact, that is precisely the reason these paintings and sculptures were favored by the Reichschancellery. The world reflected in these works is fictional, represents a stark contrast to the real world, which also may explain why the Reichschancellery bought at least 43 works executed before 1933. And that is obviously not Nazi art then. Its agents were particularly keen to purchase depictions of nudes, but still lifes, idyllic scenes, landscapes, and depiction of family life were also favored. Representations that reflected propagandistic goals were popular as well. And now to the public reception after 1970. The numerous landscapes, still lifes, and nudes of the Nazi Reichschancellery art collection are still in the depot. Most of the works are completely unknown. Public interest in Nazi art began to develop in the 70s, and in 1974, Bertolt Hin's exhibition Painting in German Fascism was staged in Frankfurt. That was the first exhibition talking about this Nazi art. Despite a growing awareness, only a very limited selection of the Reichschancellery inventory of painting was known to the public. The collection also became the subject of heated discussion and debate in which the Bundestag also eventually became involved. A problem with the growing debate was partially because the objects of the discussion, that means the collection was largely something about which most of the people knew little. Ultimately, only the same limited selection of prominent works made their way to international exhibitions. Here's a brief selection of the works. You know the Kallenberger Bauernfamilie. This is very popular. It's a peasant family. It has the notes on the back of the painting. You see where it was exhibited. You see it over there. You have all these labels on it. Yeah? And you see some upstairs. So you see the history of exhibition on these labels on the back of the paintings. We made photos of the backside of each painting we have in our collection. Here you see it's, on the frames, you see all this, the history, where it's very often exhibited. Here you see the file. You see it's in the Bundesarchiv. It's from the Central Munich, what was the document center? No, Central Collecting Point coming, yes. We have on display with 120,000 files, and here the file of Wisse, which, because this painting passed the Central Collecting Point, like the Vermeer you find now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And on the next, here you have the index card of the Bundesoberfinanzdirektion. And well, it's quite interesting to see the history of those paintings. The next one is Adolf Hitler, the nude, and you see the history too on the back. And we have I've included a file of the Giddy online. And here Wassersport by Ernest. Its paintings are really shown very often in those exhibitions. And of course, you shouldn't forget Adolf Hitler and Janusz. And Merker and the Märzfeld in Nuremberg. You have the same problem with the critical reconstruction with it. It's called on display. They're still there, and they have a critical exhibition in there. Not such wonderful line of exhibition and critical comments on it. I would prefer those critical comments on the Märzfeld in Nuremberg. And so it was it, just to get an idea about the research on it. There was, however, no inventory catalogue on which curators could refer. In light of this, it is justable to speak of a partial perception of the collection and to point out a fundamental problem regarding how these works in particular, as well as the legacies of the Nazi state in general, are dealt with. While the Reichschancellery collection disappeared into the depot and the academic community only took limited notice of it since the 70s, other works were quite visible. Following the war, without of the least oppositions, films created before 1945 were shown that depicted idyllic scenes, mountains, nature, and landscapes. That means the illusory world, and one of that was away from the violent realities of the Nazi period. But in the 50s, the films were on display all the time, and you can still see them without any critical comment on it. Even with regard to the use of Nazi structures, people were not overly sensitive about their past. Both the House of German Art and the party headquarters in Munich quickly found new users. Even the rally grounds in Nuremberg was not demolished. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank Sabine and Ulrich for inviting me to this show, but most of all, Okwi and Wesor for trusting me that I could pull this off in such a short time. This is basically a coincidence that I'm sitting here and that I did this show based on the fact that we had our annual conference of the German Deans, the Deutsche Rektorenkonferenz in München, in Munich, when was that? November 3rd last year. And I wanted to see the Molino show and the Black and White Ellsworth Kelly show, so I came here to Haus der Kunst, and I bumped into Okwi, who I had met last in San Francisco, because I was there to lecture, and we talked about Kassel, about running a school, why an artist should or could run a school, how to run the museum, about Haus der Kunst. That was November 3rd, 2011. And then I left, and I thought the Molino show was kind of rather technical, and the design didn't really talk to me. Nari Bagramian, my friend and artist, was included in this show, and I had the chance to meet the designer of that show and Chris on the terrace a year before when I was preparing, or even 2 years before when I was preparing my performance for the Hermann Dallet show that was taking place in Haus der Kunst. So, and another funny fact is that I was actually in the last show of Chris Dercon here at Haus der Kunst in the very Ehrenhalle, the middle hall. I had two sculpture projects that were part of Tiergarten Bestiarium. And then the Ehrenhalle was completely wrapped in dark, heavy, gray velvet fabric from floor to ceiling. So with these memories, I left the show. I was glad that I had the chance to talk, by coincidence, to Okwi and to Ulrich. We left, and then Ulrich was running after me in the street. Christian, I have an idea. We want to ask you something. Would you do the show 75 years of Haus der Kunst? I said, oh my God, when should this take place? Oh, June. It's just an archival show. I said, very interesting, let me think. And then 4 months, nothing. And then mid-February this year, I got invited to come to the Thomas Ruff opening, and we had a very nice lunch with Okwi, with Markus Müller, and Sabine, and with Marco Graf von Machuska. And after a very nice meal with some glasses of wine, we went deep down into the archives. And you see Ulrich Wilmes, Sabine, and me, not in the actual archive of Haus der Kunst, but of the Ausstellungsorganisation, those people who made many, many shows. So this is the first time I smelled the dusty archives, and I found stacks and stacks and stacks of catalogs that had not been sold, and I went into files and, can you see that? Yes. So I had done a show here in the early 90s, 1993, at Kunstverein, which was, of course, the architecture also next to the theater museum where Untitled Kunst took place. And that show's title was Forgotten Future, Vergessene Zukunft. And I compared Veit Harlan's films and ideology with that of late modernism, mostly of Le Corbusier and Nicolas Schoeffer. And I thought that at the time, Le Corbusier or late modernism was strictly not present. Little did I know. So first time I went into the archives, I just picked my year when I was born, November 1957, and what was in the file? Le Corbusier at Haus der Kunst. So I said, this is interesting. Yes, I want to do this show. So when we went next door to the actual archive of Haus der Kunst, we found this rather disturbing book, Kunst und Rasse von Paul Schulze-Naumburg. And within this book we have, for instance, pages like that. Oh, wrong. Wrong. Sorry, I did the lecture just before. So you have on one hand modernist paintings, and on the right-hand side of deformed human bodies. Another double page of this book, published in the mid-20s. Who is I'm surrounded by historians. I'm an artist, sorry. Late 20s, right? Okay, so what? 1928. It was published. Okay. So among the archival treasures is also this poster in fantastic condition of the first show of the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellungen. Because when I was invited, we basically looked at, that's an example of Große Deutsche Kunst, Große Deutsche Kunstausstellungen of Haus der Kunst. A hunting scene of, can you read it? Of Göring, and the other one is Reichsminister Rudolf Hess. Hess, okay. So no deformed bodies, but hunters and gatherers. So I said, where will this show take place? And then Ulrich and Sabine took me upstairs at the Wilhelm Sasnal show, that so-called North Gallery. I said, how are we going to transform these drawers and drawers of papers and correspondence into this show? I mean, when is it taking place? Oh, parallel to Documenta. I said, that needs to be a miracle, that this can actually open in time. This space is gigantic. So I said, when we do this show, we should not just have it in a gallery, but we should also use the show. We should not just use a model, but we should actually think of the house as the exhibition display itself. So one of the first photos Sabine Brandl showed me was this image you've seen before with those artificial trees that look like umbrellas. So they have metal structures, and over them they have some kind of netting. So they made to look like it's a row of trees, and the roof line has some kind of like bay window. So it's supposed to look like a segment of a street in Munich. I would think. I don't know. That's how I read this photo. And this, we have included this. So of course the Haus der Kunst was paraded around Munich annually, and this is one of those paintings that you saw, that I found in the archive, and I said, I have to absolutely show it, and you have it now upstairs. So that is the inspiration of the white chocolate model that you see upstairs. I was at the Salon du Chocolat à Paris, and I saw a kind of white chocolate reconstruction. Only 5 minutes. Okay, I'm the one who has been, that's typical. Thank you for giving me a voice anyway. 5 more minutes. So 2 months to do a show and 5 minutes to talk on the panel. Anyway, I said to Okwi, we have to, inside the house, we have to show the house, nevertheless, to see the totality of the show. And I suggest you to do it in chocolate. And then Okwi said, I don't like chocolate. Why chocolate? We need to tell the journalists why. I have no idea why. I said, it's all about seduction, the seduction of fascism. So this image you've seen before, and I said when I start with the facade, and you saw before the image of my camouflage in pink, so the opposite colors, so the mode of hiding the house and why this house still stands and why Alte Pinakothek, all the others were destroyed, the kind of netting and camouflage. I wanted to alter it, use the kind of opposite colors, not greenish colors, hunting colors, but in fact show what they were hiding, to really turn it around. So instead of Hitler occupying the center, and maybe reconstructing that in a kind of Hans Hake way, I decided, no, let me just knock out one wall, the one where the journalists and the radio broadcasters stood above Hitler. And I asked the Haus der Kunst to really remove that wall, bring back the balcony, and bring back the axis, the view that you actually, the visitors of the show could look down into the Ehrenhalle, or now called Middle Hall, or Hall of the Friends of Haus der Kunst. Here you see the removal of those bricks. And for the very first time, you can actually now look down into the main space. This photo was taken just now. And you see the kind of like absence of presence of the visual connection between the upstairs and the downstairs, and where Hitler used to stand and give his speeches. Now a model of the export show from 1946 is taking his place. displayed it like a kind of cinema movie poster of the post-war era. To bring the sound back of Hitler's voice, or this era, I said the visitors need to go through a bath of this kind of brown filth, and I wanted to show the kind of harmlessness of Hitler. He's just having coffee on the terrace, enjoying the beautiful view to the Monopteros, and we actually, Sabine showed me photos of post-war. You have the Americans sitting under the same umbrellas, sitting on the same chairs. When it was turned into an officers' club, nothing changed, just one word was removed. It was not anymore called Haus der Deutschen Kunst, but Haus der Kunst. So this model that you see in a movie upstairs, I decided to have it rebuilt 1 to 40 in white chocolate and occupy the center of the show. But the back, I wanted to really physically show the extent of the talk that Hitler gave. So there's no audio or film recording of his horrific speech to the inauguration. Parts of this speech were used in the original catalog and typography of Untitled Kunst. And I decided to really use the exact, what do you call it? Replica. It was just taken, it's like what it was in the book is now upstairs. And that's one of... Sorry? Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it became like a huge chocolate box. You see the model, but there's not enough time that I can tell you all the stories that I wanted to tell. This is one little detail why I decided to show the paintings from the back. That you come from the central hall, the core, the heart of the show, you can call the brain in Karolin's terms, the brain of the show, and you face these paintings that were shown in these annual shows where Hitler purchased many of those very works. He also hand-selected the paintings, and his assistant was actually having an electric wheelchair to speed up the process of selecting, where they said yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And there were literally hundreds of works of art shown each year. And here you see who's the owner, who should it be sent back to, name, and family name, not needed, only one word, Führer. This is a letter of Edward G. Robinson when he asked about the remainders of his Franz Marc painting. This is the kind of level it took. This is the kind of menu of the famous Picasso show of October 1955. And I think I want to end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm sure we will come back on the exhibition. I only interrupted you in order to give the public the opportunity of asking questions. So later. So thank you. Please, Mark.
It's nice to be here. Although the word nice doesn't really work in this room. You can say it, but it has no effect. It's also possible that chocolate has no effect in this space, which is why it's so interesting to be here. I mean, our theme is the reconstruction of the post-war museum, and of course this is an interesting phrase because as the exhibition downstairs demonstrates so clearly, the more or less impossibility of the concept post-war. And I would extend that not just to contemporary understanding that we are in a state of continuous war, but surely what Benjamin was describing would be, it would be unwise to describe that as pre-war, as if this is the rehearsal or the intimation of a violence to come. It is the violence itself in strategic operation. So it's warfare. So in a moment in which the concept of post-war seems not very strong, also the word reconstruction, perhaps we can almost say the opposite, that we just as it seems impossible to use the word post-war, it seems impossible not to see oneself as being in the business of reconstruction. So reconstruction is, as it were, compulsory in everything. It is surely the very mechanism of advertising to rehearse to offer you a rehearsal of the endless reconstruction of the identity that you are going to purchase. So in a sense, reconstruction is mandatory and post-war is impossible, which of course reminds me of that, I think it's Viennese expression that the situation is a complete disaster but not impossible. And so then the question of this building is immediately with us, because of course this building perhaps is most obviously the least innocent of museums. So if we're going to have this conversation, this is the right museum to have it in. I'm sure there are candidates, rivals, but this is surely the champion. This is a building that is itself considered a criminal. It was itself, in a sense, placed on trial, a war criminal, and as with all such war criminals, was formally stripped of its regalia by the Americans and buried or imprisoned in a layer of white paint. And the white paint was seen to have the force of erasure. So in a way, the history of the building was cleaned by the white paint, which was literally covered all over this building in 1956, but it was a process that started, I think, a little bit earlier. So to engage with this conversation, it's impossible for me to separate the two exhibitions, which I found both of the exhibitions enormously interesting. And that is to say, I can't separate the conversation we're having now with the conversation of yesterday about the status of the image in relationship to what used to be called war. And indeed, I would like to think of your show upstairs and Sabine's show as actually part of the show downstairs. And the only crime I think I'm committing in doing that is a crime of historical, of periodization. You know, the show downstairs is Gulf War and beyond, and the show upstairs is from before. But it's not a crime of type. So what does it mean, for example, to place the photographs and the images from the archive upstairs, downstairs? And surely yesterday we understood the operation of the artist as a kind of archiving, and even in Didier's terms, a kind of modest archiving, that is to say, refusal to appropriate. It seems to me that it's enormously important to recognize the fact that the documents in the archive were, from the beginning, artworks, and thought of as such, and conceived of as such. And so the fact they have been stored in the basement does not mean to say they are stored in the memory or stored outside, but actually are understood as a kind of a weapon. To take for one example, but an example that I think we would need an entire conference to discuss. If you assemble all of the photographs that show Hitler in this building or around this building or near this building, and just consider that, let's say, as a kind of subject for analysis. That is to say, Hitler standing by the model of the building, standing with the architect, banging the foundation stone, on the sites of the foundations itself, giving speeches, guiding guests into the building, of which there are many, buying art, in which there are images of the purchasing happening, and looking at art. And it is the looking at art image that finally we would have to consider. What does it mean for us to look at the figure of Hitler? Hitler looking at art in this building. But also, what does it mean for us to look at the image of Hitler looking at art in this building? And we are in this building looking at that image. And here today, one more time. So here we are in this building looking at images of, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in those images, Hitler occupies almost every position of the so-called art world, that is to say, client. He even imagined that he was the architect. He thought he would even take over the studio of Troost when Troost finished. He is also the commissioner, the interpreter, the curator, and finally, in the most difficult of all, the spectator. That is to say, the appreciator of the art. And again, when I say these were, all of those images I'm describing, which would be seen as sort of documentary images, were of self-consciously artworks. Not by chance, Hitler's personal photographer was made the commissioner of the great exhibitions. And so there is an intimacy between these photographs of him in relationship to this building and the exhibits in the building itself. And surely it's extremely complicated for us to look at those photographs, and let's say just a little bit more so when we do so inside this building, because I think those images don't easily allow us to carve any kind of space into those images. That is to say, we are more or less obliged to stand alongside him looking at those images on the wall. And that is to say, we literally, with all of the implications of standing beside him, and I think that there is not a kind of easy therapeutic or distancing relationship possible. Maybe to try to frame how we could approach those images in terms of the question of this building and its preservation. Of course, what is so stunning about this building, and it is indeed a remarkable building, is it is so resolutely modern. This is one of the most modern structures of its time, that is in its construction techniques, in its lighting system. You see something of it here, by which natural and artificial light become one in a system which is highly industrialized. In the air conditioning of the building itself, the machinery by which the air can be regulated in each of the spaces, the scale of operation, the industrialization that's implied in having 40 rooms of the great shows of German art, the industrialization implied in the fact that every single image is hung at the same height, in the same dimension, and in the same way, according to very precise formulas. The industrialization, even of Hitler's purchasing of art. I didn't know about the electric wheelchair, but this is just too good to be true. There are, of course, classic photographs of Hitler walking down a kind of alley of photographs, yes, no, as a kind of Fordist image of art. We can also add the size of the audiences, the average of 600,000 visitors per year. All of these comments are comments about the modernity of this self-evident, self-conscious, and quite extreme modernity of this building, only very, very lightly disguised by the apparent classicism of the stone, which is wrapped around the steel structure as a kind of image. So there is a machine, you're inside a machine, a machine which wears, and I love Chris's point, wears a fabric of stone. But even that stone, we could discuss in detail. And let's compare this very quickly with a more or less contemporary museum, the Museum of Modern Art. That is to say, that museum devotes itself to the exhibition of the modern, as distinct from the modern museum, which tries to exhibit something what one might call classical, and many different kinds of classicism. Actually, the Museum of Modern Art building, which goes up in 1939 after the earlier versions of the museum in the townhouse, is much less modern in all of the characteristics that I just described than this one. And not by chance, the Museum of Modern Art building of Durrell Stone and Goodwin of 1939 uses also a white stone as an attempt to sort of give modernity itself the dignity and connection. And this is a maneuver common to all modern architects. So essentially you have that museum we most identify with not just with the exhibition of the modern, but also seeing itself as being modern, and of course the exact works that it will show being the works that this building is associated with the annihilation of. In fact, the reversals are very multiple. And the most interesting, it seems to me, of all, is that this building here attains the sort of whitening of the walls, of the exhibition walls, before the Museum of Modern Art, which is it's transitioning from a kind of brown to a beige to a white, and that white is only accomplished in the building of 1939. So this building, which is the walls are extremely whitened, and I was very interested in the image that Sabine showed of the year later of the renovation of the building in Venice, where you see that white wall is now taken to the floor with only a small ledge of stone, whereas in this building the stone is brought up about 1 meter. But of course the purpose of that ledge that comes up 1 meter is to reinforce the apparent and absolute neutrality of the surface that rises up behind the stone. So the stone is in this building very much just the framing or the positioning of this white wall that Hitler is looking at. And of course this white wall is the exact image of neutrality and of innocence, but it is also and necessarily the end result of cleansing. So the white wall is the very representation of the maneuver that he is seeking to make, but the accomplishment of the maneuver, the full violence of the maneuver, is visible only in this building, in the whiteness of that wall. The very same whiteness that we would find ourselves having no difficulty looking at and feel no shame in looking at, and feel that we are not in any way participating in all of the different logics of cleansing. The very white wall that we will somewhat too comfortably associate with the Museum of Modern Art and not get into the extended history of the white wall, which absolutely comes back to Germany and to Essen in particular. So what my point is here is just simply that when we look at an image of Hitler looking at a painting on the very white walls of this building, the maneuver by which that white was positioned there, which is the same maneuver that allows us to watch the photograph, makes anything like reconstruction a radically, radically difficult proposition, which is what I think Chris's whole project was trying to maneuver, because there is actually there is no action one can make that would not constitute a crime in that sense. And I would note that in that sort of typology of images of Hitler in relationship to this building, in which white plays many roles, from the coat that Troost is wearing, to the white of the model itself, which is paraded in many different forms, to the white of the dais in which he makes the speech of the foundation, to the foundation stone itself, and so on and so on. In all of those images, I think the images of the speeches made in the Great Hall are distinctly different. They have a different personality. And in those images, the white is what you see behind the balustrades. In other words, it's there in the distance. So the room, the experience, the theory, as it were, is in the room. So that's the theory that you're hearing, literally yelled at you. And the accomplishment of that is awaits you, both inside the gallery and inside a transformed world. So it's not really that I'm making a point here, but just to return to the thought that the question of reconstruction is and the history of the attempts at it is a complete disaster, but not impossible. Within that context, I think it is considerably more difficult to distance ourselves from that which we most fear in this situation. It's much more difficult to accomplish than we would think. I mean, the history of the last few decades suggests that there has been some kind of a therapy which allows literally the regalia and the history of this building to come to the surface, that the art to come to the surface, to the archive to literally now be in the gallery. There's a sort of a suggestion that we are now, as it were, distant enough to come to terms with these documents. And I would suggest that we are not at all able to accomplish any form of distance in relationship to these. And this is not simply because the specific Nazi, it's not a legacy or a trauma in relationship to the specific politics of that specific moment, but it's a much more general inability to stage any kind of distance. And distance, of course, is a very nostalgic ambition, full of all the dangers that I'm describing. The white wall exactly allows the viewer a detachment from the world and from the object, which allows the object to be, as it were, appropriated by the eye. So distance is not, in fact, the goal here. I'm not saying that we would be able to proceed were we to be able to, as it were, lose the distance. The question is quite the opposite. We are at the very center of that image, for sure. And the question is more like pushing out from inside the image, and where you want to push. And I really think we're super unsure about the outcomes, which calls for another form of nostalgia on my part, experimentation. I think there has to be a lot of experimentation and some pretty deep analysis, of which this few minutes I just gave you was not a good example.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to all the speakers of this podium. I would like to open soon or now, the discussion for the public and for you on the podium. So please feel free on the podium to ask each other questions, and would like to invite you to make suggestions and ask questions, please, on the exhibition or on whatever.
May I say something?
I just have a quick question for Monika Flacke. From the works that were confiscated by the U.S. During the war, the works that you had sort of talked about, have all the works been returned, or are there still works which have not been returned by the U.S. government?
The works were not really confiscated.
There were no works that were confiscated by the...
No, all works, not only this from Haus der Deutschen Kunst, all works which were in the possession, Linz, Göring, Rosenberg, all the collections were collected here in Munich by the Americans and passed the central collecting point and were restituted to the countries where they came from. For example, Austrian paintings and art were restituted to Austria, Dutch were restituted to the Netherlands, and so on. And the German pieces belonging to the German Reich came to the Treuhand, I don't know the English term for it, and are now under the administration of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland.
But I think you asked for the more than 12,000 works which had been exhibited, not the looted art question.
Right.
So we don't know, we can't know where these more than 12,000 works of art, not all of them pictures, are, because many of them, and most of them even, have been bought by private people, and probably most of them are still hanging in
private
still
houses.
Yes, nice still lifes or landscapes. And so this collection, you can tell on the 700 paintings in the Berlin Deutsches Historisches Museum. But we don't know where most of these works of art are today.
But many of them, the Haus der Deutschen Kunst exhibition were selling exhibitions, and so everyone could buy paintings, whatever he wanted, and they were sold during the exhibition, and then were brought, I think Ms. Brandl knows better, were sold to private people. And museums bought too. I mean, they are still in the depots of the museum, but not many. And
yes. Sabine Brandl and Karen Fiss.
Well, we both just wanted to clarify that there are still works in DC, yes, and what the collection, which is actually under the Army, I mean, if you visit, the curators are like Army people, they're not curators.
Did you talk about the German war art collection?
Yes.
No, they are less. Well, most of the paintings and the prints and graphics and sketches are given back in the first selection was in the 50s, and the last one was in 86, were given back to the Federal Republic of Germany. And I think 400 stayed in the hands of the United States government.
And from what I understand, it was based on the subject matter, like the one, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the German war art collection. The German war art collection has around 10,000 pieces. That's something different.
So, Sabine, noch eine Frage, dann wollte Herr Müller noch mal das Wort erheben, oder? Hattest du eine Antwort? Ach so, okay. So,
I actually didn't want to respond. That wasn't what I was going to say.
Dreht Sie hoch. Reden Sie.
I just wanted to respond to Mark Wigley. You know, that this show is just one part, and of course, you know, it is very much related to Bild gegen Bild or image counter image, but we strictly did not have the time to produce an extensive catalog. But of course, I see the catalog, right, Sabine and Ulrich and Okui, as totally crucial part of the show. But thank God the show will be up for 7 months, and I see the show very much as a work in progress.
Yeah.
And without the help of Effe Erendler and Stefan Silvestri, and of course the incredible knowledge of Sabine Brandl, we could have never pulled off that show in such a short time. But we also depend on the notion and the response of you, the specialists, but also of the people of Munich who experienced these times. And our focus was 33 to 55. And of course, Chris has the incredible knowledge of having run this house for a long time, but I didn't have that chance. I just had to jump in and run. But I just want to give us time, please. The catalog will be incredible. It will be very important, and you will find lots of answers in that catalog. So please give us a chance and read the catalog.
But I think it's a great show. It's interesting that you. I think you should be asking us to do the work.
Yes.
In other words, you have pulled into the gallery these key symptoms that require a lot of work. I think this is what's great about the show. I mean, that's why I love the show. And in my mind, it's part of the other show, not simply by coincidence, and surely it was a plan anyway, but logically speaking, it's absolutely part of the show. You could also argue the reverse, that you can appreciate counter-memory more deeply if you think through the implications of the show upstairs, because it changes.
In listening to you, Mark, and also what Christian had to say, I think one of the major work to be done right now, and I know that Sabine Brandl and other researchers they have the ambition to do this, is to really do something about these hundreds and hundreds of installation photographs which exist, right, of the exhibitions of the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung. Is that correct, Sabine?
Yes, you find all these photographs, the installations photographs, which were made between 1938 and 1943 in the database, Giddy research. And this was very interesting for us to see how all these paintings and sculptures were arranged, the arrangement in the Haus der Deutschen Kunst. And it was very new for us, yes, how they have the neighborhood and how they look inside this building.
Now, Christian Fuhrmeister and then Michael Diaz, please.
Yes, I think this is a great panel because it raises a couple of questions. My question, the first one is, why do we talk about a museum? Because Haus der Kunst was built as an exhibition hall going out of the Glass Palace, and it, to my knowledge, never had a proper collection of its own, which would be one of the prerequisites for a museum. But regardless of that, Monika Flacke highlighted the fact that the Reichschancellery bought 45 works executed before 1933. And this is, I think, a very important fact I would like to stress, because it helps us to transgress the binary opposition of National Socialist art within this building and, let's say, the avant-garde being suppressed in the degenerate art exhibition. The boundaries are, to my belief, they are blurred, and we have much more problems if we go into these difficulties. Gabriele Münter applied in 1937. She was not accepted. We have very, very many instances where modern or avant-garde artists tried to be part of what was then to become the National Socialist exhibition. And the same argument that Mark Wigley was doing about the, I quote, the extreme modernity of the building. We get into uncomfortable fields if we think of modern and modernity with regard to National Socialism in a different way than we are used to do that. And I think that's the... So the stressing of continuity and radical breaks, which has to be reversed, I think that is one of the challenges we are approaching now.
I've found a counter-image of the Haus der Kunst in Marino. Can we show that? In 1989, Christian Braunsfels was part of an architectural group of activists who wanted to have the Haus der Kunst exploded. and they actually made a fantastic animated video clip, which is a couple of seconds. And here you see these two images from the timeline. And this is a very interesting counter image of the Haus der Kunst. We skipped it, but I thought it was interesting to show it because this is probably the ultimate form of critical reconstruction.
Michael Diaz?
Can I just this for a while? If it's okay. I actually feel that it's very important to heed the advice that Christian has just offered and that Mark has just offered in his talk. I think these are actually incredibly problematic areas that have been, in a sense, lost in ways that could become unproductive. And this also, again, creates that kind of, this example creates that kind of radical break that actually Christian is arguing against, that the way that we've actually come to define what is avant-garde, what is modern, what is modernism, what was National Socialism, creates these categories that actually mythologize the actual history and can actually create the type of distances and lack of true engagement and relationship, that notion of Benjamin's Jetztzeit that we talked about yesterday, but with Miki Ball's presentation. But also I just wanted to come back to Mark's really, really very observant points in bringing together the Haus der Deutschen Kunst and the Museum of Modern Art, because of course there were connections in terms of politics as well. Philip Johnson very clearly had fascist leanings. The founder of the film library, the film program at the Museum of Modern Art, Iris Berry, also her former lovers were Ezra Pound, Lewis. I mean, she had very good brown shirt credentials. So I think, again, that's just another example of where the way we've set up these definitions of what creates, you know, this progressive democracy, beauty, avant-garde, and what was National Socialist and timeless and regressive. And anyway, so thank you.
Ja, Herr Diaz, haben Sie? Sie sind ja gerade daneben.
Very difficult for me to give my arguments, for I'm not as happy with the exhibition Geschichten im Conflict, for me. And after we heard what Chris Dercon said, what Mark Wigley said, it's too naive. And there's no strength argument in it, and the presentation is decorative. And so let me talk about one detail. The window you opened remembered me when I first saw it at the bunker, the German bunker. And I don't know whether you thought about it, but so we are within, looking out into the Ehrenhalle, we feel to be in a bunker. What does it mean? Is it a critical reflection of the Nazi era, or what is it? It's just the chocolate model of the Haus der Kunst that doesn't work after this long time of discussion. It's a sort of naive, childish form of artistic intervention. You have to, I have to, yes, I have to apologize, but it's not the form we need today to handle with this very critical stuff. And the discussion had to be before the exhibition opened or has been planned. And so all the arguments we just heard could have been implanted, but though it doesn't work, not at all.
That's a critical point. Do you want to answer? Do you want to answer something, or I don't know.
Well, I have an indirect answer. Maybe you can help me understand this. I know what you mean about the bunker, but that actually makes it sound like a good idea to me. But depends on what we think of the bunker. But I have always puzzled why the door is so small to this building. It's really radically small. I mean, it's polemically unusual. And I don't know, Sabina, maybe you know the real history of why that's the case, but one of the effects of the smallness of the door is a bunker effect. I mean, in other words, it's an unavoidable consequence of the narrow opening. And I know there's ambiguity about the front and the back and all of this. There's many different doors to this place, but the fact that the door that will appear in all the propaganda images is so small.
Maybe I can answer. This is Paul Ludwig Trost, who had this building and the other party buildings on Königsplatz are his first major architectural projects. So before he had planned only private buildings and steamboat interiors. Yeah. So his architectural experience is not, let's say, the one of huge scale, but the one of private buildings. And this is why the doors of this building and of the party buildings on Königsplatz have the same size. It's let me say, his architectural pattern.
Yeah. No, but I love your explanation, because one thinks of the little door on the side of a boat, halfway up a boat, but
let me add one thing. Near Munich, you have Speer's building of Thorax atelier. And Speer, obviously, for another purpose, obviously, but he made huge doors of this atelier. Doors which are, I don't remember the exact size, but these doors which can be opened with just one finger pushing, in contrast to these doors. But this is an architectural
I apologize for this, but we're about to have lunch. But just to give you a sense of where I would go with this, this building is entirely filled with doors. One of the great statement made by this building when you enter it is... And
with openings, not with doors.
Well, I mean, yes, but the opening that implies the door. If you're, for example, in the main hall where he makes his speeches, in fact, the room is constructed of these enormous frames, which then create a slightly smaller frame to enter each major space, and then in each major space, slightly smaller again. So for me, the explanation of the domesticity of the front door in relationship to his previous commissions, I think it's a fantastic explanation, but it is also a highly ideological statement at the level of propaganda. It's the inverse of Speer's strategy.
Maybe it is, but it's also, at least I think it's so, it's a sign of his incapacity of dealing with a huge scale, because he's always leaving or parting from a small pattern, just enlarging it. And so
it's a little Egyptian.
Yes, a little bit.
It's an Egyptian, which of course gives the sort of sarcophagus.
Small things in bigger. Yeah, sure.
I just want to give a very, very brief response. The bunker is totally intended. To me, it's called house. So house implies small. In English, we have in the show this American or English brochure called Temple, the Temple of the German art in Munich. But to me, this is a real bunker to protect the art from the world, because with Hitler, the museum guards were armed, right, Sabine? Up to the very last day, they had paper supplies. It was considered as important as the battles during the war front. So to me, this building is a bunker. And to me, it's interesting that you're inside the building, looking at the building, in the very core of the show.
Did anybody, I would like to invite you this afternoon, I think it's open, to see the actual bunker of the Haus der Kunst, which has now been opened, and it has been cleaned, Mark, and it shows the selections of video of the collection guts, and it's really interesting when you talk about bunker archaeology, just to go and see the concept of the bunker down the Haus der Kunst. Another thing which I think which might add to Mark's comment, and Sabine has to correct me, I think in the program of the Haus der Kunst in 1933-37, that it was explicitly said there was no art going to be shown in the ehemalige Ehrehalle, right? It was only for Empfang and for speeches, correct? So it was for theory, it was the head, it was the catalysator, so to speak, of the Haus der Kunst? Maybe you can explain.
Yeah, they were only used for press conferences and the openings, but they were also sold in the Ehrenhalle postcards and tickets. But let me say something to you. First, thank you for this critical comment. That helps us, that brings us further. The first question was how to show history. And I think that's a very difficult question. And so we have to decide to show or to show this exhibition in various parts. And there's a very strong part, it's the archive, the documentation, and there's also the intervention of Christian Philipp Müller. But there are second parts, and I personally think they go very good together. They are two spaces, a very emotional space, and then you see the documentary space. And perhaps the alternative would be very much archive materials in glass cabinets. So I think we should, we all have to try some forms for exhibitions. There's not the real super good exhibition form. And this exhibitions like we made gives us the chance to think about how to show history.
I would like to respond to Michael's very emphatic critique of the exhibition. First, to thank you for offering that critique. But I think it's important to also note that the value of the critique in terms of the different conceptual resources that Christian used to try to illuminate what at heart is a very difficult proposition, in which we can do away with an exhibition that concerns the archive, that concerns the history of the institution, by just simply letting the building be, because that is the object of historical reflection. But having said that, I think that one of the things we really have to learn to struggle with is the tension between desacralizing Haus der Kunst and fetishizing Haus der Kunst. I think one of the things that I came to when I arrived here is to say that buildings have no subjectivity. You can't put them on trial. I mean, if we want to do that, then every building in Europe, or most buildings, most historical monuments, we really have to look at them very differently. So what we are trying to do with this exhibition is an attempt to enable us to institutionalize the possibility of reflecting on the conditions, if you will, of showing this material, but also of moving the material beyond this kind of sacred box in which it will be placed. I think that Christian's work, I believe, is an attempt to act on the building. To make this model out of chocolate is not only just simply the kind of scatological connotations that come with its consumption, but this is something that, in a sense, will be eaten, by moth or by whatever. The very degradation of that instrument of ideological power that's being used in so many different ways as parade models around Munich, as a kind of sacred bear on the altar of great German house in Paris. I mean, there are so many different turns in the usage of this material that we cannot, really look at this particular proposition as a kind of infantilist fantasy of an artist. It is an attempt to act on the immobility of this. And I would dare say that, that to foreclose any attempt to desacralize the way in which the history of this place has been objectified would be a great mistake. I think we really need to open it up to different kinds of interventions. Let me just simply conclude by saying that one of the things that we are doing, this is not the end of the exhibition. Christian mentioned the catalog that will come. But next year, we are embarking on a project of building a permanent gallery for the archive of Haus der Kunst, where we will have multiple opportunities each year to invite people. Perhaps, Michael can be the first one to invite historians, invite artists, invite architects, each year to make a project within the context of rethinking the model of this institution. So I just want to offer that. This is not the end. I think that Christian has given us a provocative opportunity to think about this tension between desacralization and fetishization. Thank you.
I think we should leave the last word to Okwi, no?